Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Amir M from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode. And this was kind of like an impromptu, last minute coordination because I received a LinkedIn message, I think it was from you, Amir, right? Like say, hey, I'm done. Anyway, we'll get into all of that. And I was like, oh my God, I need to have you. I need to have you on the show next week. Let's record this. Let's do this because I'm so excited with with the news that you finished your dissertation, your postdoctorate, you're a professor at Notre Dame now. I'm like, I'm so proud and so excited for you, Amir. How are you?
I'm doing good, Sammy. Thank you so much. When I contacted you on LinkedIn, I was kind of like, I hope she remembers me. I hope
Are you
it's
kidding me?
so
Are you
well, and it was just so great to speak with you. It was like nothing changed. It's like no time had passed, and
Yes.
I'm so lucky to have met with you, and we'll talk all about how we ended up meeting and whatnot.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's been a crazy ride. So just thank you
Yes,
for
it
having me
has
on,
been.
and I'm excited to talk with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say that Amir Sadeh is a researcher. That's how we met. A mutual friend said, you're going to be studying what, for your dissertation? And due to the work that I do in the community, serving recent arrivals from Spanish speaking countries, but particularly after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, there's been like tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans that have moved into Central Florida. That's why, our mutual friend said you need to talk to Sami because she's very involved in the community and she might be able to point you in the right direction, introduce you to people so that way you can complete your work. And so that's how we met. But I wanted to start off, Amir, by saying that I just candidly asked you, why are you interested, about Puerto Rican migration? Like how does that even appeal to you, And your answer was just like amazing and it really moved me. And, you know, why? Just share
So,
with, our audience why.
of course, and you're certainly not the only one who, when I asked for an interview or asked to speak with them, they were like, "So why are you interested in the Puerto Rican community?" Which is very fair. So me personally, I'm Iranian American. I was born in this country, but my parents actually came to this country. My father came in the 70s. My mother came in the 80s. Both of them leaving for political reasons, right prior to the revolution and after the revolution. So for me, I felt a sort of kinship with the Puerto Rican community, not necessarily the same experience, but understanding having to leave your home due to dire circumstances in order to, kind of fulfill an American dream or to kind of,
Hmm.
do something that's better for your family. So
Hmm.
I understood that, in a kind of base level, and I just was interested to see, how was the Puerto Rican experience pre-Maria, but especially post-Maria.
Hmm.
Are there any similarities? For me, it wasn't even about research. There was just that quizzical, like I wanted to understand, and kind of
Yeah.
from there, it's kind of how that grew. So um,
Yeah.
I'm just glad that I was able to speak with so many amazing people such as yourself and really help illuminate that understanding of the community.
Yes, and of the migrant community too, because I think that that's fundamentally the big aha that
Mhm.
we come to realize when we have these shared spaces, when we have these candid conversations, when we're really curious and come from a place of empathy and compassion and sharing and honesty and transparency and authenticity, is that it's all the same, right? That all of these
Absolutely.
things, gender and culture and background and, all of these lived experiences are important. I'm not saying they're not, but the basic humanity of people, it's all the same. The basic wants of people to live with dignity, to really support their children and give them a better life than what you had, etc.
Oh,
All of those
absolutely.
things are basic and are very primal in a way, right? That it's like it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
down to those, yes, to those very basic wants and needs
Everybody
from a human level.
Yes, everybody wants, a belly full of food, some money in the pocket, and like a roof over their head. And there's something very universal about just those needs. And when, like you mentioned, we all have our own different lived experiences. There's a uniqueness to it, but I think fundamentally we can all find an agreement in
Mhm.
just that we want a better life. We want a good life for ourselves and a better life for our children. And I think that
Yeah.
is something beautiful in the universality of it. And that's how I think the beauty of me as being Middle Eastern, being Iranian, able to make a connection with members of the Puerto Rican community, the migrant community, the transitory community. It's is that fundamentally there is this base need that all ties us together. And I think that's really the beautiful part of it.
Yes, and across ages too, right? Because I'm
Exactly.
much older and across anyway, I'm so happy and so excited to have you and to spend this time with you, because we had a lot of long conversations. And so
Mhm.
just to see what the end result, and then when I asked you last week, what's the theme? Like, where did you land on with the title of your dissertation? And you told me, I'm like, oh boy, I don't want to hear
Yeah.
anything about it. I want you to talk to me about it and all of your findings, yet in live recording. And so here it goes, everybody. The theme is Mobilization and Maria, meaning Hurricane Maria, demographic change in Florida, and the future of American politics. Bam.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Talk
mean,
to me.
that's
Talk to me. Talk to me.
yeah.
What did you find out?
So so essentially the big thing from the dissertation, I will just kind of lay it out. You know, all we hear about nowadays especially is, the demographic change is so important, right?
Yeah.
Demography is destiny. And um, one of the big thing I talk about in my dissertation is, well, we have this demographic change, and of course, that's getting people interested along, all political lines, community organizations right now. And some people would want to say, oh, well, as demographic change occurs, that means that, the political destiny of this country is predetermined. And
Mhm.
I actually argue that no, that's not necessarily the case. That in reality, there are a lot of important factors that need to come into this, specifically voter mobilization and really reaching out to these communities and making sure that their needs are taken care of. That if you want to get people out to vote, you have to give them a reason to vote. You have to give them the tools to vote, help them to overcome those burdens. And specifically with the Puerto Rican community, I was interested in this concept of what I deemed ascribed liminality. So, this idea of
Mhm.
Puerto Ricans in this country are in this liminal space, this middle space of being Puerto Rican, but also American, and yet their lived experiences are very much in this middle ground and
Mhm.
ascribed because it was put upon them by the US government, right? So, because of that, Puerto Ricans, especially in Florida, where, as we know, the margins of elections are so close that any change in demography can mean the difference between who wins and who loses. That gives Puerto Ricans a special seat at the table where they're allowed to
Mhm.
kind of use this liminality in order to make things better for Puerto Ricans living in Florida or living in the US, as well as helping to determine situations on the island, whether we're talking
Mhm.
about statehood or economic distress and whatnot. So, the whole point that I tried to bring up is that Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican community is just a microcosm of where America's going as a whole. That we are
Mm,
that the future of American politics is changing. But in order for these people to be truly represented, we need to take the time and use our resources in order to get people out to vote, overcome the burdens of voting. And only then will we be able to truly realize that form of political representation. And hopefully, that means some sort of relief and a better understanding as to what happens with Puerto Rico. Does it become a state? Does it stay the way it is? Does it become an independent nation? And then, but also more importantly, just what happens with the Puerto Rican community living in Florida, which is its
mhm.
own set of issues and concerns that deserve to be addressed in a real substantive manner. So that's kind of
Yeah.
the long.
Yeah, and especially by virtue of the numbers, right? 1.1 million Puerto Ricans, I think was the last count, live here in the state of Florida alone. And I know that nationwide, specifically on the mainland, I'm not talking about the island. There are more Puerto Ricans living now on the mainland than there are actually on the island itself. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. I think that also the dynamic between the New Yorkers or the New
Yep.
York Puerto Ricans, and then also the Puerto Ricans coming from the island, and how that plays out here locally is very interesting. And so, what do you foresee as being a driving force in that mobilization or in that civic engagement process moving forward?
Well, for me, the thing that I realized when doing my research, there are a lot of ways to kind of mobilize individuals. And in the literature and political science, we kind of think of two major ones. We think of proactive mobilization and reactive mobilization. So this
Mhm.
idea of either proactive, going knocking on doors, getting people registered, get out the vote sort of,
Yeah.
techniques. And then there's reactive mobilization, which is reacting to a negative external force, right? We saw this with the 2006 immigration marches. We saw this with 2010's, the bill in Nevada, with the HB 1070. So we have these two kind of ways in which people are mobilized, and the reality is the most effective form of mobilization, that one that actually, that is more consistent and that makes individuals become consistent voters, is proactive mobilization. So
Yeah.
actually knocking on the doors, doing the work that's necessary. Now that's easier said than done, right? It
Mhm.
involves resources, it involves a lot of time and effort, and it's not something that you can just do 2 months before an election. Effective
Mm-mm.
mobilization is year long. It's providing resources and opportunities, not just a month before election day. It's something that has to
Yes.
be consistent. And there has to be consistent outreach to the community, especially when we talk about a community which they came to this country because of a major emergency,
Mhm.
Hurricane Maria. And many of these people, they're coming to Florida for the first time. They don't have resources. They're trying to find schools for their children, trying to find jobs, a place to live. Voting is number 10, 15 on their list of like needs. So, as we know, just voting in general, there are burdens such as, where do I vote? Where is my location? What do you mean registering to vote? All of
And
that
now they
stuff
won't, and now you're not allowed to hand out water in Georgia.
in Georgia. And this is a perfect example of we're
Yeah.
seeing, as a
Yeah.
response to the 2020 election, you
Yeah.
know, that voting, registering people to vote, voter mobilization, and getting people to vote is becoming more difficult by one party because it advantages them to limit certain sectors of the population to vote. And I think that it's very telling. I teach a class. I'm teaching a class right now on race and the Supreme Court. And right now we're talking about voting rights this week. And
Mhm.
Georgia's a perfect example of just we see changing in voting laws to in order to, tip the scale, if you will. And
Mhm.
so voter mobilization is what's really important. And unfortunately, with my research, I found that mobilization is not all the same. There are a lot of discrepancies in Florida when it comes to getting out the vote, unfortunately.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that because there's no cohesiveness in how to do that with the Puerto Rican slash Latino community,
Mhm.
I think that's why, there's some hiccups and we didn't turn the state this
Yeah.
time around. But I gotta say that's something that's very admirable, and it's a model to follow with the Black community and
Mhm.
Stacey Abrams and all of those organizations that were really hitting the pavement and leaving no stone unturned to ensure that everyone in the community had access to exercise their vote and to try to eliminate barriers. And I'm sure that, I mean, it's like, thanks for letting us know, right? That you're trying to
Yeah,
put in all of these new impediments or barriers, so that way it gives us ample time to figure out a strategy to overcome them.
exactly.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
course. And I think that, the issue in Florida, what I found was, you know, like we've mentioned, there's a lack of cohesion, right? There are many organizations, but they're siloed and they're doing their own things, right? And there's a lack of funding that people get from major parties, such as the Democratic Party. They want to give funding, but they give it tied, for instance, to voter registration, right? But they're not going to give money for civic events, or or providing those sort of resources. Um, and there are a lot of issues as to who's kind of coming in and trying to mobilize people. There's a lack of trust when it comes to giving the resources to community leaders in Orlando or in Florida.
Hmm.
A lot of
Hmm.
times political campaigns want to bring in people out of the state because they feel more comfortable with them and they want to have them run it. And unfortunately, these people, they don't have the connections that you have, Sammy. They don't have the connections that people who've been living here for a long time have with the community. So where, like when I first came to do my research, I've lived in Florida almost my whole life. And the first month of the summer was just making connections. Just me, before I even gave like my first interview, it was, who can I meet? Can you connect me with this person? Can that takes a while. And I just wanted a, 30-minute interview. Now imagine trying to do a statewide election to try and get people to vote. It takes a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. So I want to definitely just in this moment, just give my kudos to the community organizers, community leaders, community activists, because it is not easy work. It's a thankless work, but it's so important to our democracy, the work that you guys do.
Aw, that's awesome. That's great. And there are a lot of them, that put a lot of heart and effort and energy and even go out of pocket to make it happen. I got to tell you something. I think I had shared this with you when one of the conversations we had is that in 2016 I became very frustrated because of this type of
Mhm.
approach of, oh, we're 6 weeks out to the election,
Yeah,
let's mobilize the Latino Puerto Rican community. And I said, I'm out. I'm checking out. You're doing this again, and I basically withdrew, and then look what happened, right? Not because of me. I'm just saying in general, it's just that since this, it's like you can't expect to keep on doing the same thing. It's like that saying, right? And expect a different result. I mean,
exactly.
it's people aren't going to come out. You're not going to be able to mobilize on folks. And so I had said to this group of leaders, and I remember that night, I'm like, you call me in for this, like to mobilize people 5 6 weeks before the election? Nah, I'm out.
Yeah.
We should we
It's,
we
I
need
mean,
to be doing this way ahead of time. Yeah. Hmm.
at that point, when you're 5 weeks out, it's like you're shoveling water off the Titanic. It's almost a futile effort at that point. Unfortunately,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
the die has been cast to some extent. I mean,
Yeah.
early voting happens right around the 3 week-ish mark, depending on the state. Right,
Yeah.
people have already started voting, and as we saw with this last election, early voting was so important. Right, I mean, it was due to
Hmm.
coronavirus, but still, I
Yeah.
mean, so it just adds to the importance of this needs to be considered months and months in advance and even a
Yeah.
year in advance. But of course,
Yes.
people, the resources, if you don't have to give money somewhere, if you don't think, then you don't want
The
to, right?
power, the people
Exactly.
possess the
Exactly.
power. Come on, just claim it. It's a control thing. But it was very interesting because the same way you were able to accomplish like these milestone things this year, I feel that our community also accomplished several milestones this past year, 2020, even with the turmoil of COVID and all the needs and disparities that we were faced with. And it was regarding the electoral process and civic engagement. We band together. It was unbelievable. I mean, all of these organizations really came in, convened, put away their differences, and were able to, here in Florida, at least in Central Florida, and actually statewide too. I remember some other organizations, from other counties were involved in these conversations, and they were regular, and they had action items. It was incredible. And I got to tell you, that we do marketing, right? And branding. We were commissioned to work on four different campaigns to get the
Wow.
Latino voter. I couldn't believe it. I've never been this busy in my life as it was in 2020, and I just felt so blessed to be part of it. We were reached by Alianza for Progress to do a
Hmm.
campaign that we called it I Have My Vote, Yo Tengo Mi Voto. We did a bilingual campaign for Florida. Then we got called by Mi Gente, Comité Mi Gente out in Arizona, because a friend of mine in New York saw the stuff we did for Florida and said, wait a second. He was on the board of Comité Mi Gente, and they secured us to do a whole Boricua, like a Puerto Rican specific
Wow.
campaign. And so we peppered it with humor. I'm going to send it to you so you can see it. Okay,
Yes,
with a little
please.
bit of Puerto Rican humor, but also pulling at the emotion, right? At the
Mhm.
distress, out of the lived experiences of our community and our grit,
Of course.
right? That and how
Grit.
we
Yeah.
have grit, and part of that grit is exercising our voice, right? And so these were all nonpartisan campaigns. Then Hispanic Federation
Wow.
reached out to us, yes,
That's
and
amazing.
asked us if we could do a campaign targeting the Venezuelan vote. And so
Wow.
we did, yes, so we did Voces del Voto Venezolano, Voices of the Venezuelan Vote. And it was a four-part video campaign, that also we were able to pull out, and that was during the general election. And then when Georgia was up for grabs again with the
Yeah.
senatorial race off, right? We got a call again from Hispanic Federation says, "Hey, we're going to support our brothers and sisters in Georgia.
Wonderful.
Guys,
Wonderful.
could you speak to so and so?" And they put me in touch with a local leader in Georgia so we can work in tandem, a Latina leader, so we can work in tandem with her. And she was working with the Black community, over there in Georgia. So that way we can build messaging that would resonate, right?
Of course.
With the psychological and experiences of the Hispanic in Georgia, because their lived experiences might be a little bit different than the ones, than the Latino, or the migration here in Florida. And so anyway, it was great. And look at the results, you
Well,
know?
and
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to talk to you because of course I was not in Florida for 2020. So I actually mentioned near the end of my dissertation, this was again June, July 2020, and the conclusion I said, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with coronavirus and COVID in regards to voter turnout. People maybe aren't trying to knock on people's doors, or they're not, there's certain some of the traditional tactics that would be
Hmm.
used are probably not going to be implemented. So I was fascinated as to what was going on in the area and the work that was being done because it definitely seemed like, well, when you lose certain tools in your tool belt, like how are you going to make up for it? How are you going to do the work that is done? And it was
Yeah.
interesting to see in Florida with 2020, even though Trump ended up winning, it was more so to do, if I read it right, with the Cuban community in South Florida. I mean, just really overperforming in a way that just was not expected, and
Mhm.
for Trump. And I think that that was kind of the key. But I think that I just was curious as to how you felt about the overall, at least in Central Florida. How did you feel about compared to 2016 and 2018, as we previously talked about?
Mhm.
Do you think that everything that could have been done was done, at least, knowing what we know now with COVID and everything?
Yeah, with the resources that we had, yes.
Good,
Given the
good.
resources that we had, we made the best of it. We even, oh, actually, we did another campaign which was on the Six Amendments,
Oh,
and we
wow.
did a
Yes. Yeah.
explaining them for Florida on the, that you had to vote on, explaining them in very basic terms because they're complicated. I don't even understand them,
Oh,
So
yeah,
then,
I'm a doctor, and I still have to read them 3, 4, 5 times. They're written
exactly.
that way. They're written purposely to be complicated, so you're
Yes.
absolutely right.
So we had a bilingual approach even for that. So we were able to develop also. I totally forgot. So it was 5 projects that we worked on, and that was to really provide the community in English and in Spanish. The
Yeah,
breakdown of what do these what without an opinion, either or, just explaining it. And I think that the difference in how Central Floridians and Puerto Ricans voted is because I think that for the first time there was a serious investment in making sure that the Puerto Rican community understood how their vote impacted their livelihoods, and they understood, they were educated on not to vote against your interests. Like, what does that mean? What
yeah.
does that mean in this political system? And I think that we were successful in that respect. Yes.
Well, it's interesting too because, you just talking about ballots and stuff, it made me think about the discussions we had in regards to the differences in Puerto Rico versus in Florida, just with how
Hmm.
the ballots are. I mean, in
Yeah.
Puerto Rico, you have the face of the candidates on there, right? And
Yes.
it's easier, it's more intuitive. You can vote via party as opposed to when you come here, you're voting for comptroller, or you're voting for alderman, what are
Yes.
these positions, right? The
Yes.
soil and water manager. What is,
Yeah.
I
What
mean,
is that
even
exactly?
I don't know really what the soil and water manager does, but
Exactly.
there is it all is just aspects of voter education that is so important that you people need to be taught. I mean, new migrants, but even just there are people who just don't have as much experience with politics. You don't even have to be a migrant. There are people who've lived in this country their whole lives and they just
Yeah.
never vote. Um, and things like the amendments are again, designed to be written at times in a confusing manner,
Mhm.
to being able to do the work and to really simplify it as best as you can. It may not seem like a big thing, but actually it is incredibly important, especially in politics and political science. We talk about the costs or the burdens of voting. What are the kind of barriers that keep people from voting? And voter education and voter information is one of the big ones, right?
Mm.
Knowing when you vote, how to vote, even having somebody to be able to drive you or pick you up, and to vote. Um,
Mhm.
these are all important. These may seem like little barriers, but they add up, and they can
Yeah.
really end up determining who's even able to participate. And if we want a robust democracy, the goal is to have everybody who is able to participate, who's eligible to participate, should be able to participate. So
Mhm.
it's all really important things.
Yes, totally. And just understanding what the policies, the ideals, the values, the interests, right, of the political parties are too. Like, what is their framework? What do the outcomes of their policies and what they want to implement looks like? How does the
Mhm.
allocation of the funding that they are going to control, right, and all of the justices, like that too, how does that impact you, the everyday man, woman, or child,
Well, and it's
yeah.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because so I and I actually mentioned in my dissertation, I wasn't able to speak with many Republicans, but I was able to speak with a few in my dissertation. And it was interesting to see the difference in how these views are considered. So I spoke with a Republican member of government, and I brought up things like, you know, do you believe, what are Puerto Rican issues facing the community? And the individual said, well, there aren't any Puerto Rican issues. There are. That's like saying what are issues are important to people in Ohio. Puerto Rican issues are Florida issues, and very much viewed it as, oh, I find it so offensive because I find that anybody who focuses on things like affordable housing or whatnot, it's divisive. And it's, obviously I'm a researcher. I'm in, I don't have a value judgment on either opinion, but it's interesting to see how, depending on the political ideology, you can have, you would think affordable housing is just affordable housing, it's so intrinsic, but the viewpoint as to affordable housing is systemically impacting, migrant community, minority communities, whereas, the other political side is, well, affordable housing affects everybody. It's an everybody issue. And to view it as a specific issue, you're almost using identity politics, if you will. It's as a researcher, as somebody who studies politics, it's mind opening. It's like, okay, this is why I study it, to understand the differences in opinion. But it just
Well, yeah,
something so basic can be divisive, if you will. It can lead to differences in opinion. So bridging
yeah.
that gap is much more difficult than it would seem to
Yeah.
be.
Well, it's because it's rooted in privilege, right? Those opinions are rooted in privilege and many times in white supremacy. And so, if you cannot pause and put yourself in someone else's shoes or educate yourself with regards to the wealth gaps that people are born into by no fault of their own. You're born into this world, and if you're black, you have 10 times less the generational wealth than a white person. And if you're Hispanic, you have 8 times less generational wealth than the average white person. And that's just the fact. And so, if you don't understand or care to learn about those inequities that exist, coming from a standpoint of communities of color, then affordable housing, yeah, it's like Black Lives Matter. Well, all lives matter. It's the same kind of, right, it's the same
Well,
kind of psychology. It's like, but I tell my 11-year old was having an argument with one of her friends, and she was because her friend tells her, oh, but Catalina, all lives matters, all life
mm,
matters. And my daughter says, well, yeah, that's the obvious. What's not so obvious for many people, though, is that
mhm.
Black people, right, are being attacked and killed. And I'm like, you said what? But to my 11-year old. So, you know what I'm saying? So
Well,
she gets it, you see, but
well, and
that's the
and
thing. Hmm.
well, let's look at also another issue, right? Let's look at felon disenfranchisement. In
Hmm.
Florida, prior
Yeah.
to the amendment in 2018, 20%, 21% of the African American population was not able to vote due to felon disenfranchisement, right?
Mm.
This idea of not being able to vote if you had a felony. 20%, that's a fifth of the African American population in Florida. We've already talked about how close, again, those margins are.
Yeah.
So, and if we know, as we know, there's systematic prejudice when it comes to the criminal justice system, right?
Yes,
So we can
exactly.
see the connections that are made, that it's like, okay, of course, individuals, by just systemic disenfranchisement, injustice, segregation, are being uh, improperly affected. There's a disproportionate effect, and this is
Hmm.
how that systemic inequality is able to continue with things like disenfranchisement of the vote, because of your past. And I just think, again, that's just an example of, it's, I can understand the opinion, but there are a lot of uh, inequalities that have been built into the system for hundreds
Hmm.
of years, right? That
Hmm.
still manifests to this day. That if you
Hmm.
don't take that into consideration, I don't think you're giving justice to the full picture.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Yes. And so how do we how do you foresee, because that's your dissertation, right? What it says, the demographic change of Florida and the future of American politics. So how do you see the future of American
So here's
politics,
I
Amir?
I've learned I've learned since 2016 not to get into the prediction game, but
Okay.
here's what I will say. Here's what I will
Okay.
say. You know, I think it's a coincidence, or maybe more than a coincidence, that we're now having and we've been having real discussions about Puerto Rico and DC, right? Having some sort of citizenship, have some sort of statehood, right? That these are having real
They just
discussions.
appointed somebody for Puerto Rican affairs. Did you see that? That happened like a
I
week and a
I
half
I
ago.
heard a little bit about it. Well, and
Yeah,
also
you
too, I
have to
mean,
look into it. Hmm.
yeah, and also too, I mean, it it's not lost on me that the plebiscite, the recent plebiscite, was scheduled on the day of the election, the 2020 election. So
Hmm.
I think we're having I think that there are political actors who are more seriously taking into consideration the Puerto Rican community in a way that, we haven't necessarily seen in a decade prior.
Right.
I think the real issue now is going to be, how does the Democratic Party respond? So are they going to be, and again, this is what I'll say is my opinion, although somewhat informed by research. Um, there was a lack of kind of effort in certain sectors during the 2020 election. I think that there was some kind of putting their hands up to provide certain efforts, right? This idea of, well, we're not going to have people knock on doors because of COVID. And that ends up
Mhm.
becoming a very uh, you know, advantageous kind of excuse not to necessarily put in certain resources, right? And we
Right.
unfortunately see the outcome. So I hope that if the party, the Democratic Party puts in enough effort as the Republican Party does, which is far more organized in Florida, far more cohesive, and kind of has a kind of better built-in system than the Democratic Party does in the state, um, as well as providing the funds and also if the community organizations can kind of come together and work in a more cohesive manner, I think that Florida has a far better chance, right, of turning blue in the future. But again, the X factor is at the end of the day, who do you get out to vote, right? We saw with the Cuban community in South Florida, that was enough. I mean, we're talking about razor margins at this point, right?
Right.
So every vote does matter, and you can't
Yeah.
disregard any subset of the population. So
Yeah.
I guess I will say that I can't predict one way or another, but I feel like obviously there's a chance for either party to win. I just feel like the Democratic Party has a lot more work that they have to do if they want to win in the future. If they don't want to lose, I think that a lot more of time needs to be invested, money needs to be invested, and I
And good
think that
candidates.
and
And
good
good.
candidates. I mean, that's vitally important too. Uh, and I will say this, I spoke with a lot of local representatives, and
Hmm.
having either representatives that truly represent the community, whether it's
Hmm.
having a Latino or specifically Puerto Rican background, or those who are community activists or organizers who know the importance of knocking on every door, who are able to
Yeah.
do the work. That is what's going to bring change in Florida. That is what's going to, secure, democratic, positions in the local, because politics is all local, as we know.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
such importance when it comes to, getting people in the local representatives, state houses. These are important, just as important as a major presidential election. So
Right.
really, every election does matter. And I think that there is an advantage for the Republican Party just because they've had so many years of building a cohesive state operation.
Yeah.
It is the Democratic Party can, but it will need to invest resources more so than they have in the past.
Yeah.
And I feel like they just need to, and again, I don't know the background machinations, I don't know the full scope, but I think that there needs to be more trust and more of investment in the community leaders and organizers, in the churches. I mean, everywhere to if they want people to really get the work done, it just in not even in a nonpartisan manner. If you just want to get people registered to vote,
Right.
investment needs to be made. And the key should be, the idealist key should be, we want everybody who can vote to vote, and we'll
Right.
worry about convincing them later. But,
Yeah.
we wanna build a democracy. We wanna make sure everybody who can vote should vote.
That's great. I mean, that's the gem out of this whole conversation is that everybody who can vote should be able to vote. That's like the
Exactly.
basic principle. So listen, I know that you're teaching now. How's that go? How's that gig going?
It's been amazing. I mean, I love teaching. I've been doing it now obviously for the year. I taught a class on urban politics, so city politics last semester, and then this semester I'm teaching a course on race and the Supreme Court and talking about um, how race and conceptions of race have kind of occurred and changed over time. And I feel so lucky that I get to teach and I get to teach at Notre Dame because the students are, they're really interested in the sort of topics that I speak about. And I talk about my dissertation, when I
Mhm,
talk about the Voting Rights Act, I talk about the Voting Rights Amendment of 1975 and the importance of language minorities, right? The importance of
mhm,
ensuring bilingual voting material, when I talk
mhm.
about urban politics, I mean, all of that is about ensuring everybody gets to vote. That was, the crux of my dissertation was about, local politics. So
Great.
being able to, this is the pure pursuit of academia was always teaching. It was always like
Yeah.
being able to provide information. And, I know they're not going to remember what the 14th Amendment says. I know they're not going to remember, Miller versus Johnson or South Carolina versus Katz. They're not going to remember the specific cases. But if they can just remember the overall kind of themes of the course, this idea that, race and systemic discrimination still occur, the problems of viewing purely just a colorblind society without
Mhm,
viewing the intricacies of, differences and
mhm.
minority disenfranchisement, you know, if they can get the big message, that's all I can ask for. Because
That's awesome.
when I started college, and I don't remember half the things, a quarter of the things that I learned, but I remember the way that my professors made me feel. I remember the overall messages of the course, and if I can give that to my students, then I'm happy.
Well,
I feel like I've
I already know that they're lucky to have you. They're so
you're
lucky to
too
have
sweet.
you. But we want you back. I know that you're planning to come back to Florida, and I can't
Yes.
wait. And when you do, you have to call me ahead of time because COVID, God willing, right, will be over the hump.
I got my
And
first vaccine on
me
Monday. I'm gonna
too.
get the second dose. Yeah. So
Me
I'll be
too.
fully
So,
vaccinated by the
and
time
I'll
I'm in
meet you at
Florida. We'll meet
Mecatos.
up.
Uh, yeah, we'll meet up at Mecatos at the Colombian Bakery.
Yes, of course. You're gonna get the coffee, we're gonna get some pastries, we're gonna chat it up, it'll be wonderful.
Exactly. This was so wonderful, Amir. Thank you so much for making the time, to have this conversation. I feel like we're caught up and I'm so excited. And I can't wait to see you in person so we can hug it out. I really miss you and I'm so glad to call you my brother and my friend.
Well, Sammy, I wanna thank you so much for having me. Like I've said, you know, y meeting you and meeting other individuals like you, especially you though, really made the dissertation worthwhile. I mean, interviewing and we do qualitative work because we know that there's more to the numbers than just the numbers, right? Getting to
Yeah.
meet the people on the ground. And, I dedicated my dissertation specifically to, members of the Puerto Rican community and those lives who were lost during Hurricane Maria, because I know how important, how big of it is for somebody to open themselves up to a stranger, essentially. And I really can't thank you and all of the people who I interviewed enough for just opening their hearts to me, their words to me. And you've become a great friend to me. And I just know that I very much look forward to seeing you. We're going to have a big old hug. We're going to just
Yeah, yeah,
dab it
yeah.
up. And I can't wait to be
Yeah.
back in Florida.
Yes, your familia. And you know that, though. I don't need to tell you. Okay. Well, listen, have a wonderful day. And again, thank you for joining
And
me today.
anytime, Sammy. Thank you so much.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.